My name is Arthur Paul, Art Paul. I have to be an artist.
Art Paul is literally a living legend in graphic design.
He brought intelligence to this magazine in the way he positioned things against the editorial content. There, I think, he was very significant.
He's very versatile, he's very prolific. From writing to thinking to painting to drawing to typography to publishing.
Art established a visual culture in the magazine that was his, and his in collaboration with Hefner, of course, but he was the architect.
Arthur was as responsible for the success of the magazine in those early years as I was.
I don't think everybody knows Art Paul, but they should.
From the very start, Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine was nourished by Chicago's booming culture in the 1950s. This cultural transformation likely had an influence on Hugh Hefner and the content of his magazine. But no one influenced the look of the magazine more than Art Paul, the founding art director of Playboy.
What Art Paul was able to do in a very clean and a very linear way is to represent the philosophy that Hugh Hefner really wanted to communicate to his readers.
Playboy was a publication that was culturally, obviously, very influential because of the sexiness of the content and the amazing graphic design of Art Paul and the entire aesthetic and experience that it created.
It's hard to find people who've had as much impact on visual design, on visual communications, than Art Paul.
It was a really influential magazine, both as far as the magazine goes and in terms of, you know, the culture of the time.
Early 1950s America was a conservative time of traditional family roles, where men were breadwinners and the women were bread makers. It was a time of paranoid Cold War patriotism and religious participation. But while most people were wrapped up in the status quo, a handful of visionaries in Chicago were laying the foundation for a more liberated lifestyle. Magazines that started in Chicago, like Esquire and Ebony, were revitalizing print and making a national impact. But no periodical made such an explosive impact on the American culture, sexually, socially, and visually, than a new national magazine called Playboy, which burst out of Chicago and onto the national scene in November 1953.
Playboy really tells a story about what it means to be an American man at that time.
During the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was the guidebook for every young man, and I read it in college.
The magazine was a profoundly influential element at a time when there wasn't even the construct of a lifestyle magazine.
Playboy's influence on practically every aspect of American lifestyle, the sexual revolution, fashion, advertising, music, design, and architecture, reverberated throughout the 1950s and 1960s in special features in the magazine.
Business is booming. There's a new consumer market being created. There are these new ideas as the world is changing after the Second World War, and Playboy is reflecting that back to its readers.
Hugh Hefner made jokes at various times saying that if not for the girls, he would be publishing a literary magazine.
There was this running joke that people read Playboy for the articles, and in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was actually something that you could say truthfully. There was really good editorial direction, and the art direction of the magazine kind of matched that.
Well, I often bought Playboy for the graphic design. This was really groundbreaking at the time. So much of what today in print culture we think of as being very new and very alternative, those seeds were planted with Art Paul years and years ago.
That's a magazine that dehumanized women.
Very nice. Put your hands under your head.
Somewhere along the way, you have to have a feeling that that's not a great thing to be looking at, even if the writing is terrific and the illustration's great.
Beautiful.
If you remember the important role that magazines used to play in American cultural life, you'll see how important what art did for the entire culture.
He did it in a style that was very contemporary and became, quite frankly, the leader in magazine graphics in that time frame.
I actually don't think it was all that well designed. What was incredible was the art direction, because he bought really intelligent illustrations for stories. You wouldn't expect that in Playboy, largely because it was mostly pictures of women in swimsuits and things like that.
Art Paul's art direction made it an intellectual lifestyle magazine, and also a magazine that understood the culture, criticized the culture, and talked about the future of the culture. What's more intellectual than that?
And I am sure with a group of men who consider themselves intellectuals and also like looking at light porn, they have a tremendous emotional attachment to that publication.
I think for a lot of designers and the public, Playboy is somewhere between soft porn and sexual revolution.
Playboy is a breakthrough magazine with great editorial design and a wonderful place for the expression of women and their bodies.
The early Playboy house style is, for a generation of designer that came before me, it was everything. It was the coolest thing in the world.
He found a very divisive company to work for, and then in that work expressed really genuine, heartfelt sentiments, but also expressed some really critical things as well.
One of the reasons it became such an iconic force in culture is its sort of advanced view, at least for the time, of sexuality. I don't think that was Art's major interest. He was more interested in the design side of things and in making something beautiful and telling a story.
I have to be an artist, good or bad.
It's an air, and an air is a very sensitive, it's a very beautiful thing.
But he always missed doing the art and came back to that then finally when he retired. Started drawing and painting every day. It really grew. It was spectacular to see somebody just, he was always really good, but then to see somebody blossoming, it becomes so much deeper.
Not finished.
I have been painting and thinking of art and drawing and enjoying art, looking at it as well as doing it. And I'm trying to, before I have to go to the big cloud above, and or somewhere else. The reason for this is to get to know me better.
Art Paul was working as a freelance graphic designer, creating ads for clients like Marshall Fields and Abbott Labs, when, in 1953, a potential client walked into his studio.
F was looking for an illustrator to do work for a magazine that he was putting together.
Art had a studio on Van Buren, on the edge of the Loop in Chicago. And I went to his studio
He comes in and he sees all these things on the wall, the commercial stuff that I was doing as well as more personal things. And he said, "Is that your work or work you like?" I said, "It's both."
I knew immediately that I wanted him as my art director.
It seemed that Hefner immediately spotted this exact skill of an art director. An art director is someone who not only has to produce amazing work by himself, but has to know amazing work in order to commission the work of others, to commission and direct photographers, illustrators, and so on.
Arthur Paul was 29 years old when Hugh Hefner tapped him to become art director of the new magazine he was starting. Hefner, a year younger than Paul, had been working as a promotion copywriter at Esquire magazine in Chicago. That magazine was moving to New York, and Hefner took it as an opportunity to publish a new men's magazine.
I had planned on calling the magazine Stag Party.
Stag Party. Stag Party.
He was lucky because he couldn't use it for legal reasons. He already hired Art Paul. Can you imagine if they still had the name Stag Party? Can you imagine a beautiful woman wearing antlers? You know, you'd think they were in the North Pole working for Santa Claus.
So about 2, maybe 3 weeks before we actually launched, I changed the title. Changed it to Playboy. I wanted to have a symbol, as other magazines did. The New Yorker had Eustace Tilley. Esquire had Esky. I wanted a hopefully iconic character. Making it an animal would seem to be very unique.
He was thinking of a rabbit symbol, but a rabbit that does everything. You know, wears a smoking jacket and holds up a glass of champagne. I wanted it to be something so simple that when you made it larger, you could do many things with it.
It took only 1 hour for Paul to sketch the famous rabbit profile with the cocked ear and tuxedo tie.
It was incredibly important to everything about the reputation and the visual power of the magazine.
Art drew this logo that at the start was really just punctuating the ends of articles. There was a little tiny full stop or period at the end of the article.
It has a certain balance, both in its formal quality and graphic nature, but it's also witty and it has a surprise to it. And I think it tells folks that you can do a witty logo for an editorial magazine that showcases women nude, and it could all mash up together and build this perfect brand.
I knew what the Playboy bunny was probably before I knew what the American flag was.
With his iconic symbol for Playboy, he hit a grand slam home run, you might say.
Everybody knows it. You could ask a 5-year-old.
The Playboy bunny, which is a very beautifully designed form, you will look at as good or not good depending upon your perception of that magazine.
Art Paul sat down and designed the best logo any magazine in the history of the world has ever had or ever will have.
It was a nicely drawn bunny and funny, but because I have a negative feeling about the publication, there's no way I could embrace that as a great piece of graphic design.
The idea of the bunny was just so witty. It bears no relationship to the word Playboy, but it becomes a trade character that embodies that word. And he used it in so many different ways. In addition to the silhouetted logo, which has just become like a superhero logo.
It's pure Bauhaus in its design. It's the fewest number of lines to do the trick. It's perfectly consistent with art's philosophy.
It was a rabbit because rabbits fuck a lot. Everybody got it, you know what I mean?
From the very beginning, he did the layouts. He did the graphic concepts. It really took 2 rather talented and rather lucky guys to create the magazine. In that sense, Arthur was my partner.
I felt there was a lot of opportunity, and if it didn't work, why, it was just one of those things. And he felt the same way. The first issue of Playboy, if you notice, doesn't have his name on it.
When the first issue of Playboy hit the newsstands, Arthur Paul was incorporating modern design concepts into the look of the magazine. Hefner was developing the editorial content. One of the first things he did was to obtain photos of one of the most famous women for the cover of the premiere issue.
Hef got me this Marilyn Monroe picture. She's sitting on top of a car with a ticker tape parade, I believe, in New York. And so I blocked out that stuff. Got the white background. But keeping the feeling of the big city. So it was simple and it was strong.
It was a stunning start, selling more than 54,000 copies. Both the visual look and editorial content were evolving with each new issue. Beginning with Playboy's third issue, the rabbit symbol found its way to the cover.
It was not a big drawing on the cover, it was very small actually. But it began the rest of the rabbit appearances on the cover. Hef and I were very happily surprised about the success of the magazine.
In the early years, they worked very closely together, and I know that Hefner had tremendous respect for Art's visual skills and his sensibilities.
Art was so open, and Hef was so definite on what he wanted. He was so focused.
I ended up doing the first 3 issues on a freelance basis. Those issues were interesting, and they weren't the best looking issues in a lot of ways, but they certainly diagrammed what the magazine is going to be.
Art Paul's role in the success of Playboy is basically the form and much of the artistic content of the magazine. Hugh Hefner was totally responsible for the photographs and the cartoons that went into the magazine. But if that was all there was of Playboy, then Playboy would be nothing more than some of the Playboy lookalikes like Cavalier or Gent that came out shortly after.
Art Paul and Hugh Hefner had an unusual working relationship. They had a close collaboration and understanding from the very start, which enabled Art to have a decisive voice in the editorial vision.
The relationship was extremely positive. I was supportive in terms of what he was wanting to do. He found with Playboy a freedom that he needed.
Anything Art asked for, Hefner would, sometimes he wouldn't quite understand or would even, have a bit of a debate with him about it. And Hefner would shrug his shoulders and say, well, you're the art director.
He promised to say to try to give me as much freedom as possible. I think he did.
Looking through his works that he's created, I really became aware of how prolific he is of an illustrator, of a typographer, of a graphic designer, as a painter.
Art Paul never really exhibited his work. Suzanne, his wife, who is a photographer, she's the one that promoted his work.
We're going to show this to some galleries.
Suzanne has been extraordinary in helping to organize and to actually archive.
I put this one on top because it's one of my favorites. He's shy about showing his own work and about getting in touch with galleries, really just shy, holds back. Partly he just wants to focus on the work, but when you get to be 90, it's time.
Art Paul was born into a poor immigrant family on Chicago's southwest side in 1925. When he was just a year old, his father died.
My father grew up in a very difficult time without a father of his own, and so didn't have the role models of how to be a father and a family man, and had to figure it out on his own. And I think that was something that he struggled with but took very seriously. They did not have any money growing up or any security, and he was raised largely by his older brother.
His mother eventually settled the family in Rogers Park, and scrape together a meager living. Norman, Art's older brother, served as a father figure as well as an artistic mentor.
I started drawing very early in my life because of my brother. When he took a lump of clay and he made a head, like my sister fell asleep once with her head on the table, and he rolled out this clay, and he did this beautiful piece. It just sent a chill up my spine. It was just magic to me. So I think at that time I decided I wanted to be an artist.
A high school art teacher recognized Paul's talent in drawing and submitted his work for a scholarship at the School of the Art Institute. He graduated from high school in 1943, enlisted in the Army Air Corps, and spent 3 years training as a combat pilot. At the end of the war, Art returned to Chicago and was drawn to Macaulay Nagy, a Bauhaus-trained graphic designer from Germany who founded the design school in Chicago. One of the primary ideas of the Bauhaus was to level the playing field between fine arts and applied arts and to unite creativity and manufacturing. Paul attended the school on the GI Bill. The Bauhaus philosophy would have a lifelong impact on his work. Even today, he talks about Macaulay Nagy and visited his exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago.
The idea that simplicity, honesty of materials, the embracing of mass production, the recognition of how art and design can situate itself in the wider culture, all of that stems from the Bauhaus.
But Art, he had a great line once where he said that even a bubblegum wrapper ought to be designed as beautifully as you design a poster for a museum. That's the essence of the Bauhaus.
His influence from the new Bauhaus on handling space and type and color and being a minimalist and a modernist really separated Playboy magazine out from other magazines that were being done in New York.
Another essence of Bauhaus was melding fine arts and commercial arts. Paul was inspired by the work of Sippi Pinellas, the first art director to hire fine artists for Glamour magazine in the 1940s. But Paul certainly brought the use of fine arts to a new level.
He was one of the first major art directors to use fine artists as illustrators, and illustrators basically as fine artists. He just blurred the lines between the two because he was kind of both.
What he did by blurring those lines was change the way illustration in the United States was perceived and used. It used to be that Norman Rockwell was the king, the paradigm of what illustration was. You take a phrase, you illustrate that phrase.
There was one time in New York, he ran into Norman Rockwell on the street and was so thrilled. He said, "You're Norman Rockwell. And I would love to hire you to do an illustration." And Rockwell said, "Oh, I would love to." And my sons would think that was so cool of me. And so they make a plan. And then Rockwell writes him, "I'm so sorry, but my wife won't let me do this." She thinks it's improper.
Art conceived of himself as an art editor, and he hired people to do pictures that would sum up the theme of an article instead of some narrative detail from the story or from the article.
For Art, it was incredible that he would just take an artist who perhaps had never operated as an illustrator per se and said, here's a story, I trust your take on it, go ahead and do what you like.
What Art did was he converted what had been illustration to popular art.
In addition to visual art, he also experimented with music.
Well, Art is a real Renaissance man. He's an exceptional art director and artist, and his writing is as quirky and creative as his art. And he's even a self-taught composer and pianist.
He doesn't have what anybody would consider classical training. He's basically just
oriented himself to the instrument over decades. You know, he's improved his facility on the instrument and developed his own kind of musical language.
Walk into his office and he'd be humming and working and because I played the piano and have a little musical interest as well, he would have recordings of some of his compositions. He'd say, Gary, wait, I was working on this last night. You've got to listen to this.
Do you want to sit and listen to your music?
Sure.
You started taping these things in like the 80s. You gave this one a title, Riding the Winds.
Oh.
You don't always give them titles.
Happiness once more.
A friend who's a composer used to be the head of the Columbia College music department, Bill Russo, said, this is quirky stuff. This would be really a challenge to orchestrate. I want to try this for my summer project. So he orchestrated some of these pieces. That was fun.
A lot of what he does is improvised, and then over time kind of builds something of a structure. But that structure is very loose.
He plays the piano and music just kind of comes out of him very naturally.
I think he would probably have been a very good composer if he had been trained in the techniques of composition. So it reminds me of Beethoven still composing, even though he can't hear his compositions. Art's still drawing, even though he can't really see.
American culture continued to change in the 1960s with the raging Vietnam War, civil rights activism, the advent of the pill, and the burgeoning sexual revolution. The magazine stayed true to its core and addressed the social issues of the day. With its far-reaching success, the magazine continued to interview prominent figures and publish writings by established authors.
It was a social magazine. It was a cultural magazine. It was a magazine that you could be proud to hold on to. Maybe not in public because there were certain conventions and rigors having to do with our Puritan upbringing. But it was a magazine that was as much of a design entity as it was a portfolio of centerfolds.
Art Paul shaped the culture of graphic design and magazines by building a brand that takes it quite seriously and was highly experimental, that used graphic design and art direction in its most robust way, that built a brand on ideas.
Art's impact was both in publishing and in branding. He was responsible for creating this modernist appeal on the publishing industry.
The first year of Playboy, it was like design artifacts. That's like a thing in the popular culture that I think everybody is aware of as a piece of American culture, like a quintessential piece of American design.
Art Paul explored this graphic vision in the magazine by hiring iconoclastic art directors and artists and giving them the freedom to utilize their talents.
Working with Art Paul was a very, very unusual situation. He developed way before people like Apple and some of the tech companies that free and breezy atmosphere that just made creativity ooze forth.
Playboy was a textbook in design, and so art was like a god to designers, you know.
Art was able to manage us by allowing us to be who we were.
He was a master art director. He could develop people into being phenomenal talents in Playboy magazine, and he knew how to use their best skills to create something that was intriguing, something that was unique, something that was controversial. But he could find those people, and if he couldn't find them, he would develop them.
He was a stickler for little things too, like where to put a subhead or how to move the type a little this way, a little that way.
The art department at Playboy held weekly meetings to brainstorm ideas for design and illustration, and then hire the artists most appropriate for each assignment.
The idea that you had this designer who was kind of behind the scenes and bringing like the best artists and illustrators in the world into the most mainstream, middle America, like normal publication, it's so interesting to me. It's like crazy that he got away with it.
I worked as a freelancer for Playboy magazine for Art PAUL. It was the golden age of my life.
Art would give me a phone call and say, I've got a piece that I'd like you to look at and talk about.
Art PAUL gave me the assignment. He didn't specify anything, so I did whatever I feel like doing it.
I first started working with art when I was about 25 years old. I called and made an appointment with him to show him my portfolio. I was very nervous about going into the Playboy building because I'm gay. And in my mind, I thought, oh my God, if they found out I'm gay, they won't hire me because this is all about women.
Art did go out of his way to support local artists, and probably one of the most notable being Ed Paschke, who was a regular Playboy contributor.
Ed Paschke would tell the story. He said, had Art not commissioned me to do that piece, I would have left Chicago and maybe stopped being an artist.
Paul commissioned work from other prominent Chicago artists, including Roger Brown, Carl Wirsum, Seymour Rasofsky, and Shel Silverstein.
There were two coasts, and Chicago was kind of the second city, but we didn't really know a lot about what was going on there until Playboy and certainly Art's contribution of bringing Chicago into the universe of creativity.
His genius was, he took the fine artists that he knew and allowed them to put their pictures in the magazine, almost exactly like hanging in a gallery.
He built its reputation to such a level that later on he could very easily call up Andy Warhol or Salvador Dali, and they knew Playboy. They knew that Playboy wasn't just his girly magazine, it was something that was to be taken seriously on an artistic level, and he could very easily invite them to contribute work, and they did.
I did, over the years, drawings, paintings for P.G. Woodhouse, Norman Mailer, Kurt Vonnegut. My concept there was not to try to illustrate the article, but to find an angle in the story that would allow me to do an interesting picture.
It's very standoffish to walk in an art gallery, and most people would not even walk in. So we taught people art through mass media.
Age has brought difficulties, but he never complains. Macular degeneration is maybe the worst thing. Being near blind is hard for an artist, but he counters the tricks his sight plays on him by working with rather than fighting them. That's real creativity.
Yeah, this is like the cover, you know, that they're tearing the page.
I'm gonna check your vision now, okay? I'm gonna check your
With macular degeneration, you can't see what you're looking at. You only have your peripheral vision. You can't look over at it. You know, you have to look straight ahead, but everything that's straight ahead is fuzzy.
It looks like a picture of a tongue that won't work.
He would describe what he was seeing, and he knew that what he was seeing wasn't what was there.
Do you see this right here?
Yeah.
Okay, look straight at that for me, okay?
For somebody whose eyesight has been so important to his work and so important his whole life to, you know, his talent and his gifts, you would think he would feel sorry for himself, and I just never saw any of that.
Yeah, it's getting a little better.
Before he had such control, he could draw anything that his mind saw. He could put it down. He could draw a likeness and make it look like you in 2 strokes. But now, the lines are kind of crazy. There's an exploded quality to them. And I love these.
To get readers more engaged, Paul used a technique called Participatory Graphics, grabbing the reader's attention and bringing the stories to life. It was one more of Paul's notable innovations, and for which Playboy spared no cost.
Art did a lot of those. He called them participatory graphics. You just have turned the page, and then you come to this. And then you can start reading. You turn this page and you get the actual title. The Code Battle article by David Kahn.
He used die cuts so that there would be parts of a picture peeking through a hole in one page. Nobody was doing stuff like this in magazines.
Playboy was clearly a laboratory for Art Paul. You could see that in almost every issue. You could see it on the cover, that every issue there was a different idea going on. Usually they worked, but sometimes they didn't.
He would almost a cartoon effect of having one painting on the page of a scene, and you turn the page, it's the same scene, only the time has changed. So you get a sort of flip page action, which grabs the mind. You know, it's wonderful when you get one of these aha moments, you know, and he was constantly doing that.
An article on the environmental impact of developers on the Everglades in Florida. He wanted to show on the first page this contrast between, you know, some bird eggs in a nest, and then the following page he wanted to illustrate how surveyors were coming in with developers moving in and perhaps taking over the environmental area in the Everglades and changing it.
In the early days of pollution in the air, he said, which was really a radical idea at the time, he said, I want to run a blank page in the magazine, nothing on it.
When you put this outside your window and get dirt on it, and it's all filthy, it becomes a piece of artwork about how dirty the air is.
What Art was doing with his participatory graphics was basically what the digital world is all about now. It's about user-friendly, user experience, interactivity, and he was doing it on an analog level.
The surprise I have at what he was able to do with such a mass market magazine, to have a cover with no goal, just white space and some cufflinks.
What a story that tells. Whose cufflinks are they? When did that person take them off? What is that person doing now that, you know, his cufflinks are off? Paul is an idea guy. He's a storyteller. His stories are funny. They're also done elegantly.
Several of Art Paul's covers were some of the best covers ever done. The one where the girl with white gloves is looking through like binoculars, and they make perfect rabbits as he holds up her hands.
Oh, this is mine. This is my drawing. I was rabbit conscious. Also, I like the idea of drawing like this.
The thing that really blew me away, the major discovery, was the back covers. The highest value real estate you have for advertising is the back cover. Art was using the back covers as kind of even more avant-garde or abstract extensions of the concept that it was running on the front cover.
What he managed to do by establishing a trick on every cover, and that is, where's the bunny, is what makes those covers so enticing, while at the same time, they weren't just girly pictures, they were conceptual pieces.
It became a game, got the reader involved, and then people were sending pictures of the eruption of Mount Helens, the smoke looking like the logo.
I can remember getting phone calls at 2 in the morning with somebody saying there's no bunny on such and such a cover. And I would have to say, yes, there is.
Playboy magazine reached its zenith in the 1970s. Distribution peaked at 7 million. The brand expanded. At the same time, Art Paul continued the trend he started, purchasing original illustrations and artwork for the magazine.
Art persuaded Playboy to buy the artworks outright every time they commissioned a work. It was very fair with them, and Playboy ended up with this incredible art collection that actually toured in museums.
We always pay an additional fee for the ones we wanted to keep, and we did that quite a bit.
We probably had one of the biggest corporate collections of anybody in the United States. The painters that Art commissioned were Larry Rivers, Tom Wesselman, the person that did the big lips, Andy Warhol. He did 2 nudes side by side, same nude, on a canvas. I remember George Siegel doing his version of the Playmate, which was a pregnant Playmate sitting in a chair.
I wanted a rich variety, like an art gallery, and Art gave me what I wanted.
Over the years, it's kind of sad, but kind of gotten sold off, and I think Art always hoped it would be donated, but it didn't work out that way.
Art and I met more than 50 years ago in 1967 when I called on him as a freelance photographer to show him my portfolio. Then we were acquaintances for several years, then friends. We've been married for 42 years.
He's always been this warm, really interesting human being. And I think they're terrific together that they found each other, Suzanne and Art, because she's also full of piss and vinegar.
He's very sweet, romantic, but most of all, just warmly affectionate. He's a huggy person. And I always tell him I married him for the hugs.
So there's really a lot of, love, a lot of warmth.
They're amazing together, They're both very caring, very loving, very supportive people. He has become more dependent on her in a lot of ways.
Honey, don't pick up my cane. I will.
Okay. I just want to make sure it's not in this messy room.
Okay.
He is not too steady on his feet sometimes. So she does an amazing job of being instantly available if needed. And there's just been so many little moments where they're just extremely kind to each other.
Art's first marriage, he married very young, and she also was a designer. In the first years of Playboy, she did these collages with the rabbit cut out. Family was always very important, but like happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s, he was working long hours and really felt that he had shortchanged his sons. as they were growing up by working such long hours.
You know, he had a very serious and important career that took a lot of his time, and certainly his art was his passion in many ways. But certainly he loved his family and made time for his family, you know, when he could.
He's experienced having nothing and having to make something, you know, from nothing. And I think that experience made him just very human.
In 1972, the Rolling Stones were on tour. They spent the tour camped out at the Playboy Mansion in Chicago. That was really cool, and I remember talking to him one night when he came home, and he had been to a meeting at the mansion, and he was like there, and I said, well, what, you were there? He said, well, yeah, I went to the meeting, and then when I was done, I left. I said, that did not compute for a 15-year-old. As I got older, I started to get a better sense of what he was really all about and how his dedication to the craft and not the sort of flash.
Women I would meet would tend to ask me, oh, aren't you nervous with your husband working at Playboy with all those bunnies running around? Gosh, never crossed my mind. Because, you know, he's certainly not about bunnies. A very settled person.
Paul left Playboy in 1982 to explore his own artistic pursuits. He began working on commissions, logos, design explorations, and commercial work.
If anybody approached him with an interesting design job, if it was intriguing, he'd do it. Like, you know, designing a logo for a hot dog stand. He thought that was the most fun thing anybody'd ever proposed.
He loved hot dogs so much that he willingly accepted a lifetime supply of hot dogs as payment. He also designed many posters, including several for the Chicago International Film Festival. He even collaborated with his wife on a poster to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima in 1985 for the Shoshin Society. It was called War Kills the Sun.
It was an anti-war poster. We did that poster together. If war kills the sun, everything is gone. So it kind of has to be black, you know, as minimal as possible. It's about emptiness. Art has been drawing ever since he was a kid and never stopped. And he's kept nearly everything. It's quite remarkable. Worked from high school, while in the Air Corps, while at the Institute of Design, while freelancing, and even while at Playboy during meetings and after work. After leaving Playboy, Art drew for hours, every day, for 30 years, just imagine. Among my favorites are doodles on notes, cards, and letters to me, and the sketches he does everywhere on anything he finds. Did anybody ever save so much schoolwork? Oh.
Yet, for a handful of small successes, he never achieved the level he attained at Playboy. Sometimes his work wasn't even selected, as in this identity design he created for Chicago's Lyric Opera, as well as this logo exploration for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. But he never stopped creating. He's most focused on his series of heads, portraits that he's been exploring for the last 80 years.
If he was told he would never ever have an exhibition of his work in his whole lifetime, or ever, he would have still kept drawing.
Over the years, I've watched Art's creative process, which is boundless. One example is his treatment of heads.
And there were probably 400 heads that were all 11 by 14. Every single one was unique, it was different, it was incredible.
When he was a little boy, he had an obsession with masks. He was afraid of masks.
He's obviously been observing and drawing faces and heads ever since childhood. He obviously thinks a lot about the human psyche and the kind of masks that we put on in society.
All the people in your pictures used to always be serious. No one was ever smiling. Now, there's more smiling than not.
They really look to me like self-portraits of art, but they're featureless, like jagged rocks that kind of look like Art Paul.
One night, I started sorting and came across all of these pictures that were about his macular degeneration. He was doing pictures about losing his sight. And they were so moving, I just sat there crying.
Oh, I do love you, baby.
Despite dealing with the perils of aging and macular degeneration, especially in the last decade, Paul has found himself the subject of gallery exhibitions and lectures. The Chicago Design Museum organized a show of his drawings and talking sketchbooks in partnership with Cards Against Humanity.
We went through his files and through his drawings and pulled out all of these things that he'd said that were just staggering individually. But then when you look at them as a portfolio, you realize what a poet he is as well.
I think the way he thinks about language, copy, typography, it's very human to me. Like, I read a lot of personality into every piece of type that he sets, and you can almost imagine the voice of the character saying it.
The Coda Gallery in California and Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art in Chicago exhibited selections of his head series and other drawings, where he wowed people of all ages.
The nature of his work is very timeless in general. I think it's definitely cross-generational, and I wouldn't have guessed he was 90 by looking at it.
I had the first Playboy magazine. I've read it for 60 years. I followed him all through his career, and because of him, my wife and I started to collect all of the artists that he knew.
This one I like. I'm very particularly partial to. Because there's on his left eye, you can just vaguely see him looking at you, but it's screened through this blue veil, and the blue veil is me.
As you see, he's gotten older, his work has changed quite dramatically, and it's pretty varied from quite colorful pieces and exuberant pieces to much more gritty, even cartoons in black and white. You almost get the sense of he's made a journey in graphic design, and his work has done so as well.
Art has covered a wide path in his 90-plus-year journey. Most likely, his legacy will be the Playboy Bunny, though some people feel otherwise.
I think he'll be remembered as one of the most inventive magazine art directors in the world.
Art Paul is constantly running ahead of his time. I think they were important the moment they were created, and they stay important forever. In some ways, Art Paul is timeless.
He found a way to take the most contemporary ideas of his time and package them in a way where regular people, it could come into their lives and surprise them and mean something to them. He brought the most cutting-edge high design into people's homes.
Art is kind of Renaissance in that he does so many things. He gave so many people a chance. He found people, and then he gave them the freedom to do whatever they wanted to do.
Iconic design work, mentoring a school of artists, and doing really first-class work.
I think there's another piece of his legacy that maybe people haven't discovered yet, which is his more personal work. To me, that's a transition of art from a graphic designer, doing world-class client work, to transcending that and becoming an artist.
I am an artist. I have to be an artist.